Let me do a little outlining right at the outset. We're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, the 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And I want to break that down into about 3 divisions. Number 1, Paul's rights. Paul's rights. And the section on that would go from verses 1 through 14. Paul's rights. Paul has the right to financial support. Paul has the right to lead about a wife, a sister, like Cephas, the apostles, the brethren of the Lord. He has the right to support such a one and to receive that support from the brethren. All right, but now then, number 2, Paul's renunciation. Paul's renunciation. That will be at verses 15 down through 23. All of this in chapter 9. I didn't write 9 there, but all of this 1 Corinthians chapter 9. In these first 2 sections, particularly in section number 2, you're going to see a right rejected. Paul, as actually we've already indicated, will on occasion refuse to exercise his right. He has a certain right which he defends and argues for early in the chapter, but he has the right to refuse or reject that right. And we have that particularly in mind in the section that we call Paul's renunciation. Paul's rights, Paul's renunciation. This last section contains one of the best known, I guess we could say most famous, quotations from the writings of Paul. To those under the law, I'm become as under the law. To the Jew as unto a Jew. To those without the law, as without the law. To the weak, I'm become as weak. I'm become all things to all men, that I might gain or win some. A classic statement expressing a conciliatory spirit in areas of custom and culture, in areas that really are not matters of the faith. One more short section. Paul's race. And by that I don't have in mind the fact that Paul is an Israelite of the tribe of Benjamin. That's not what I mean by race. I mean the kind of race where you have a start and a finish and you have somebody who wins the crown. And so in the close of the chapter, Paul will use one of his fairly frequent athletic metaphors. And he'll talk about that all run but one receives the crown. And so run I not as uncertainly. So fight I, not as one that beateth the air, but I bring under my body, I buffet my body, and bring it in subjection, lest by any means when I preach to others, I myself should be a castaway. The close of the chapter then employs one of Paul's frequent athletic metaphors. The call to discipline here is probably to still be seen in the context of a willingness to forego one's rights. Now let's read together in the early part of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, at least I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. My defense to them that examine me is this. Have we no right to eat and to drink? Have we no right to lead about a wife that is a believer, even as the rest of the apostles and the brethren of the Lord and Cephas? Are I only and Barnabas, have not we a right to forbear working? What soldier ever serveth at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard, and eateth not the fruit thereof? Or who feedeth a flock, and eateth not the milk of the flock? Do I speak these things after the manner of men? Or saith not the law also the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn. Notice, is it for oxen that God carrieth? Is it, or saith he it assuredly for our sake? Yea, for our sake it was written. because he that ploweth ought to plow in hope, and he that thresheth in hope of partaking. If we sowed unto you spiritual things, is it a great matter if we shall reap your carnal things? If others partake of this right over you, do not we yet more? Nevertheless, we did not use this right, but we bear all things that we cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Verse 13, know ye not that they that minister about the sacred things eat of the things of the temple, and they that wait upon the altar have their portion with the altar. And then a statement that is something of a clincher in this section, as he argues for and defends a certain right that he has. Even so, did the Lord ordain that they that proclaim the gospel should live of the gospel. In one familiar translation, the Lord ordained that they that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. Now, to understand the chapter, and particularly the early part of it, you've got to remember the preceding chapter. We talked about it in an earlier lesson. Meat commends us not to God, 1 Corinthians 8:8. For neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. But take heed, lest this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. For if any man see thee which hath knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him that's weak be emboldened to eat those things that are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. But when you sin so against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Wherefore, if flesh, if meat, causeth my brother to offend, I'll eat no meat, I'll eat no flesh, while the world standeth, that I cause not my brother to offend. Now that's the way the previous chapter closed. And now Paul begins by asking, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? Are ye not my work in the Lord? Let me show you the connection. When you look at it hurriedly and superficially, it looks like that the start of chapter 9 has jumped to an entirely different theme and subject. It has not. In chapter 8, in the discussion of the sacrificial meat, the meat offered to idols, Paul has argued that Christians are, in some circumstances, to forego their rights out of a deference for the weak brother, out of a genuine concern for that one who had certain scruples that would be offended by a certain course of action. One might forego his rights. Now, Paul really has not left that, even though it would seem on the surface that much in chapter 9 is unrelated to that. Paul is going to illustrate that principle in his own life. The rejection of a right, the refusal to exercise a particular right. And early in the chapter, the use of the questions is sort of the diatribe form used by writers and speakers of that day, as questions would be used, and a sort of exchange would be understood between perhaps an opponent or a debater. Am I not free? And some of them are surely thinking, listen, if you allow the conscience of the weak to determine your course of action, you're not free. Boy, you're enslaved to that weak brother. And you're bound by his scruples and his conscience. And if you should relinquish your rights, your personal rights, or apostolic rights and authority, then are you free? How could you be free? Paul said, am I not free? Am I not an apostle of the Lord? My apostleship is not endangered by what I've done. In fact, I've demonstrated one of the real qualities of a Christian and one of the qualities of a real apostle. A responsible inner restraint. A willingness to forego my freedom in certain situations. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Are not ye my work in the Lord? Hey, Paul rests his apostleship here on a couple of things. Number one, have I not seen the Lord? You might make a note there of chapter 15, verse 8. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 lists post-resurrection appearances to Cephas, to above 500 brethren at one time, etc. And as to one untimely born, he appeared, Paul said to me. So I've seen the Lord. Let me give you another evidence of my apostleship. The Christian community of believers in Corinth. Your very spiritual position attests to my apostleship. If I'm not an apostle to others, surely I am to you. What have been the arguments against this apostleship? Some of them might surprise you. Paul hasn't exercised his right to be married. And more significantly, and covering much more of the paragraph, Paul has not accepted from us monetary support. And so he must not really be an apostle. And there is at about verse 12 the indication some others, perhaps apostles, had accepted support, Paul hadn't. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, surely I am to you. Verse 3, I make my defense. And defense here is that word apologia. We have our English word apologetics. Here's my defense. And so Paul proceeds with it. Here's the defense that I make to those that examine us. Have we not the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to support? Do we not have the right to lead about a wife, a sister, a wife who is a believer as the Cephas, the apostles, and the brethren of the Lord? And the implication is, if I did that, I would certainly have the right to support that one as I am supported by my brethren. I have that right. And then he begins to argue for that right to monetary support, first of all, using certain arguments from everyday life in common sense. What soldier goes to war at his own charges? Here's a guy that goes into Uncle Sam's army, but he leaves his old vocation behind. He doesn't take that insurance business with him. And he doesn't go to war at his own charges. That was true then, it's true now, and we can understand that argument. Incidentally, in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, at verses about 3 through 7, Paul makes some similar arguments, arguing for diligence and for hard work, but perhaps also urging Timothy to be willing to accept the support of his brethren. We may take a look at that in a moment. What soldier serves at his own charges? Who planteth a vineyard and eateth not the fruit thereof? The husbandman, the vine dresser, the farmer, eats of the fruit of his labors. Who feedeth the flock and eateth not the milk of the flock? Somebody would say, yeah, but Paul, these are just illustrations from life. Not sure you proved your point. Well, does not the law say the same thing? And he makes appeal, as he states it, to the law of Moses. Now, Paul knows that we cannot enjoy a righteousness in and through the law. It's been annulled. It's been taken out of the way. But he recognizes its value for instruction. And he has in mind the Old Testament. When in Romans 15:4 he said, the things written aforetime were written for our admonition and learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. We dare not seek justification by that abrogated system. There is worthwhile instruction there. All right, the illustration of the soldier and the husbandman and the herder and the flock, that is taken from everyday life. But now let's look at Scripture. What does the law say? And he quotes Deuteronomy 25 at verse 4. The very same passage that's used by Paul later in 1 Timothy 5 at 17 and 18 when he talks about the support of elders who rule well and labor in the word and doctrine. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially if they labor in the word and doctrine. For the Scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his hire. The last part of that quotes Jesus at Luke 10:7. Well, the very Deuteronomy passage, which in 1 Timothy 5 is used by Paul to uphold the practice of the support of that elder who rules well and labors in the word and doctrine, works at preaching and teaching. The same passage is used here. And then Paul explains, certainly, in context, the law is talking about the humane treatment of animals. But is that the only lesson? Is that all that God has in mind there? Is it not for us? No, it's for us. The Lord means by that the laborer is worthy of his hire. If the ox is not to be muzzled when he treads out the grain, even so the laborer is to be supported. And so he is argued from everyday life and common sense. He is argued from Scripture. Deuteronomy 25 at verse 4 here in verse 9. And he points out in verse 10, this is said, assuredly for our sake. In verse 11, he argues from the less to the greater. There are really from the greater to the less. We've sowed unto you spiritual things, the greater blessing. Is it then a small thing if we reap from you carnal things? We have the right. Barnabas and I have the right to accept from you support. Paul is arguing here. Others must have partaken of that right. Verse 12. We really don't know who they may be. Maybe an apostle. There's indication in the letter Cephas has had some contact with this church. Now, if others have that right, do we not yet more? And then Paul makes appeal to the practice, not only under the law, but even in pagan religion. In Deuteronomy chapter 18 at verse 1. Numbers 18 at verse 8 and following. Various parts of the Old Testament makes it clear that there were perquisites of the altar, and that the priest received a part of the offering. That was true under that Mosaic system. That was true generally in other religious systems. Paul makes appeal to that in verse 13. Know ye not that they that minister about sacred things partake or eat of the things of the temple, and they that wait upon the altar have their portion with the altar. And then the clincher, so far as this case is concerned. So the Lord ordained. Now, some believe that this may be referring to some particular statement of Jesus, the Lord, the Kurios, the Master. Luke 10:7, the laborer is worthy of his hire. That may be. Paul receives his gospel by revelation. Galatians 1:11 and 12. He may have in reference something, or have in mind something the Lord said. He may simply be speaking, inspired of the Spirit, and under the guidance of the Lord, and states, the Lord ordained that they that proclaim the gospel, they that preach the gospel, should live of the gospel. Now let me just pause here to say that the one who preaches the gospel ought to have the attitude that Paul will later express. Woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel, I must preach. And so I would preach if I make tents, or if I'm supported by the brethren. And that pretty well sums up the way it was in Paul's case. Paul did accept support from some congregations. In Philippians chapter 4, 15 and 16, no church had fellowship with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but thee only. For even in Thessalonica you sent once and again to my necessity. Later he will write to this Corinthian church, 2 Corinthians 11:8. I robbed other churches to do you service. While he was working in Corinth on occasion, other churches had helped him. I know from reading Acts 18, it tells us about the planting of the church there, that he stayed with Aquila and Priscilla because they were of the same trade, and he wrought. The text says, Acts 18 verse 3, he stayed with Aquila and Priscilla, and he wrought. That is, he worked with his hands as a tent maker to support himself. The attitude of the one who proclaims the message ought to be, I'm committed to proclaiming this message, whether supported by Corinth or not, whether supported by Thessalonica or not. Those would happen to be two congregations from whom Paul did not and would not receive support. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, 2 Thessalonians 3:8 and 9. Or whether I work with my hands as a tent maker, however, I'm going to preach the message. That's the attitude. Now on the other side of it, we need to understand that the Lord has ordained that they that proclaim the gospel should live of the gospel. It's a rather interesting thing that in Restoration history, Daniel Summer was one. And another whose name is still pretty well known because of his writings with which we do not concur. But a long, long time ago, when this particular man made a very conservative emphasis, he took a very similar position, Daniel Summer. And following him, W. Carl Ketcherside argued that the one who preaches the gospel might on occasion receive some gift, but never could he receive a stipulated sum. Summer argued against a located preacher, he called it, though it's obvious that Timothy is located in Ephesus when Paul writes those letters, and Philip the Evangelist was located in Caesarea for about 20 years. If you look at the end of Acts 8, and then Acts 21, 8 and 9, and there was a tendency on the part of these brethren to argue really against the support of those who preach the gospel. There's still to this day places like Nebraska and Kansas and eastern Colorado and other states in that general section of the country. Congregations, some of whom are still influenced by that, others of whom have come out of that, but suffer sort of a negative backlog because of that. Well, Paul makes it very apparent he has the right to support. And we have here a well-argued case from common sense and everyday life. The soldier, the farmer. Compare that with 2 Timothy, chapter 2 at verses 3 through 7. No soldier that warreth entangled himself with the affairs of this life that he might please him, who's called him to be a soldier, Paul said. And thus he uses some of the same illustrations. The hard-working farmer in that same context. In that context, the athlete is used. But anyway, Paul argues from everyday life. Paul argues from the law. Paul argues from the fact that he has brought to them the spiritual things. And then he argues from the general practice of the priesthood. And then the most important thing, verse 14, the Lord ordained this. But notice that 14th verse is surrounded by verses in which Paul says, we did not take advantage of this. The following verse, but I have used none of these things. And now we come to Paul's renunciation. A right rejected. Paul, do you have the right to monetary support? Yes, I do. But there's one thing I don't need in car rent. I don't need to hear people saying that I'm preaching for money. And so while I have that right, I have the right not to use the right. And that's what I've chosen to do. Now he's just said, I'll eat no meat while the world standeth, that I cause not my brother to offend. How can you be free with that attitude? How could you possibly be an apostle? And how can you call upon us to have that attitude? And Paul says, well, I have that attitude. I am free. I am an apostle. And I'm willing to forego my rights. Verse 15, here's a right I have that I've not exercised. In fact, you see, I have to preach. I stand between woe and go, and woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. It's not altogether a matter of choice. It's certainly not a matter of chance. Necessity is laid upon me. I've got to preach. But there is a reward for me. And that reward is that I will preach without monetary reward when I choose to do that. And so I will bring the gospel without charge. And no one can deprive me of that boasting. I've got to preach. I must preach. There is something in Paul's heart that must come out through his mouth or his heart will burst. His heart will break. I think Paul could identify with Jeremiah. When Jeremiah said, because the word of the Lord was made a reproach unto me and a derision daily, I said, I'll speak no more in his name. But his word was in my heart like a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I grew weary with forbearing. And I could not stay. I had to speak. And so I have nothing to glory of if I preach the gospel. Paul is saying here in the next section, for necessity is laid upon me. For woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. We don't like to hear about duty today. We don't like to hear about punishment today. But the great missionary of the first century church seems to imply something of both. I've got to preach. I must preach. Necessity is laid upon me. I have nothing to glory of if I do preach. But I can glory, and I find a reward in preaching without a certain kind of reward. And you can't take it from me. And I won't be deprived of that glory. And now if you don't like what we said about the meat-eating question, and my urging you to forego certain rights, I want you to look at my own case. Here's a right rejected. Here's Paul's renunciation. And now listen again to one of the great classic statements from verse 19 and on. Although I was free from all men, I brought myself under bondage to all. I am free. Verse 1. But I have brought myself under a voluntary, self-imposed servitude or bondage to all men. I am the slaves of all. And I am ready to accommodate myself as far as I can to other men in order that I might save some. Though I'm free from all men, I brought myself under bondage to all, that I might gain the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain Jews. Timothy's mother was a Jewess. Acts 16, the early verses, 1 through 3. Paul has Timothy circumcised. In Galatians chapter 2, Titus is a Greek, no Jewish blood. And they're false brethren who would compel him to be circumcised. And Paul said, to whom we gave place by way of subjection, no, not for an hour. In areas of custom and culture, Paul is conciliatory. I want you, though, to keep in mind the Galatians 2 example. We want to say something about that in a moment. To the Jews, I became as a Jew. Acts 16, 2 and 3 would be a good example of that. To them that are under the law is under the law. Not being myself under the law. He's not under Moses' law. That's been taken out of the way. Close to the verse that we almost sang tonight, Paul said, I through the law am dead to the law that I might live unto God. Galatians 2 at verse 19. So, to them under the law is under the law, though I myself, Paul said, am not under the law. To them that are without the law, that would be the Gentiles, Romans 2:14, the Gentiles which have not the law. To them that are without the law as without the law. Not being without law to God, but under law to Christ. Not an outlaw to God, but an in-law to Christ. One translator tried to render that. Paul says, I am under law, but I'm not under that old law. Not without law to God, but under law to Christ. That I might gain them that are without law. To the weak, I'm become weak. It's interesting to me, he doesn't talk about the strong here. To the weak, I'm become weak. I'm ready to forego my rights for that weak brother. I'm become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. I do all things for the gospel's sake, that I might be a joint partaker thereof. All things to all men, that I might gain some. Let me sum that up very briefly. Now, the part of that you like is the briefly, I know. But let me sum it up briefly. In areas of custom and culture and human judgment and human preference and expediency, Paul could be the most conciliatory of men, exercising a responsible restraint and not exercising his right. Exousia, power, a word that recurs over and over in this chapter, but virtually always in the context of Paul's willingness to forego it. In areas of custom and culture, Paul is conciliatory and even compromising in that area. In areas of the faith and matters of divine revelation and the truth of the gospel, Paul is the most unbudging and unbending of men. The truth of the gospel is that all men, regardless of race, place, anything else, are saved through Christ and His cross. And to compel Titus to be circumcised, in effect would be to say, it's the cross plus circumcision, and the gospel plus the law that saves. And Paul won't concede that for a moment. If it involves a principle of truth, he will not bend, he will not budge. In areas of custom and culture, he's the most conciliatory of men. Let's look at Paul's race. As Paul now uses the athletic metaphor. In Corinth, one of the great games, the Isthmian Games, maybe the second largest, most famous, noteworthy athletic event of the time, took place in Corinth. And now Paul uses that kind of example. Know ye not that they that run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize. Even so run that you may attain. Now that may mean exercising some discipline. That may mean being willing to forego your rights. But run so that you might attain, Paul said. And every man that striveth in the game exercises self-control in all things. Every man that trains for the masteries, the King James has it. Over at Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, there's an old gym. I think the official name was Rhodes Fieldhouse, but nobody would know what you were talking about if you used that term. And I'll admit, I frequented that place rather often. And down on one end there was painted up there, every man that trains for the games is self-controlled in all things. Well, that's taken from this very passage. The Greek runner exercised self-control and restraint. Now they do it to receive a corruptible crown. The winner in his event would get a Stephanos, the victor's crown, a palm wreath, an olive wreath. And I don't have to tell you, that was a very corruptible crown. Wouldn't last very long. But we an incorruptible. So run I not as uncertainly. So fight I not as one that beateth the air. No shadowboxing for Paul. But I buffet my body. I bring under my body. Hey, there has to be discipline. And the war is still going on, and the conflict and the contest is still going on. And maybe the shocker in this section is that the great apostle to the Gentiles could himself miss out on the prize. The Calvinist doesn't want to admit that. But in the next chapter at verse 12, Paul's going to say, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Paul said, I bring under my body. And that certainly would include this willingness to exercise restraint and discipline in the foregoing of rights. It would also involve something we talked about recently on Wednesday night in 1 Peter. Abstain from fleshly lust which war against the soul. 1 Peter 2:11. I buffet, and that means literally to strike with the fist. Paul used it metaphorically. I buffet my body and bring it into subjection, lest by any means when I preach to others, I myself should be a castaway. One of the great lessons. Hey, we have some rights, but we have the right not to exercise their rights. And Paul stands forth, strongest and best, when we see the great apostle willingly foregoing rights that are his. We need to have that attitude, I'm become all things to all men that I might gain some. We're not trying to make Oklahomans or Americans. We don't go into another culture with that in mind. We're seeking to lead people to Christ. And as far as we can, we adapt ourselves to custom and culture while never compromising the great essential truths. And then finally, there's a race to be run. And there is a fight to be fought. And there is a place for discipline. Exercise thyself rather unto godliness, Paul writes, 1 Timothy 4:7 and 8. Exercise is gymnazo. We get our word gymnasium for that. Discipline yourself. Control yourself. And throw yourself wholeheartedly into the fight. The stakes are high. And it's your eternity that's involved. We're going to be singing a great song that appropriates the words at the close of a great chapter. Matthew chapter 11. Paul, or Jesus rather there, has upbraided Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum. And then his tone changes. And a loving Lord said, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest in your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And that Lord calls tonight that you might take His yoke, His authority, but find in that His rest. He said, preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that disbelieveth shall be condemned. We're urging you tonight to meet His terms of pardon, to come back home,